8 February 1943, Impel, India. A motley group of British, Gurkha, and Burmese soldiers set off on what their leader has described to them as a great adventure. While there are certainly no rules governing when and where war can be taken to the enemy, there are generally accepted lines that mark what is considered the front. These men, known as the Chindits, are about to cross those lines and strike at the enemy where he least expects it. Led by the eccentric Indian-born Colonel Lord Wingate, the Chindits cross into Burma to fight as a guerrilla force, disrupt Japanese supply routes, and strike targets of opportunity. Although they have trained for months, the operation was almost canceled at the last moment by British commanders. Initially, it was intended as a precursor to a massed British strike into Burma. With the cancellation of those plans, British commanders informed Wingate that his part in it was also canceled. Wingate, however, successfully argued that the guerrilla tactics he had developed could still be useful in disrupting Japanese operations, and was given permission to proceed. Wingate knows that this is an unorthodox style of warfare, and therefore he adopts an unorthodox style of command. Standard military protocol is abandoned. The men grow beards, their uniforms grow shabby, and saluting is left to those fighting on their own side of the enemy's lines. This failure to observe traditional military regulations does not mean there is a lack of discipline. Wingate places tremendous demands on his men. Their very survival means staying one step ahead of the Japanese, and they are therefore compelled to keep moving even when physically exhausted. Although they are relatively few in number, the Chindits are causing the Japanese real headaches. C-47s deliver ammunition, K-rations, medicine, and anything else they need to fight and survive in the treacherous jungles of Burma. The men quickly retrieve and distribute the supplies and are on the move again. Fighting this type of war requires a special breed of man. They must be resourceful, bold, and resilient. With each success, they not only disrupt enemy operations, they deny him a sense of security that he would normally enjoy this far behind his own lines. For the Japanese, the Chindits are becoming increasingly troublesome. Beyond the logistical problems created by the destruction of key bridges and roads, morale in the theater is beginning to suffer. The soldiers of the Imperial Army, used to fighting a conventional war, are now faced with an elusive enemy that strikes when least expected with devastating results, and then disappears. Wingate is elated. His confidence in his men and in his tactics has been vindicated. His operation, which was almost canceled, has met with astounding success. It has been, in many ways, the most effective campaign yet waged by the Allies in Burma. February 14, 1943, Tunisia. With Americans threatening to launch a drive which could divide the Axis forces in Africa, recently arrived Colonel General Jurgen von Arnim launches an armored assault on Allied positions near Sidi Bouzid. Codenamed Frühlingswind, or Spring Wind, the offensive catches the inexperienced American forces off guard. They prove easy pickings for the new 63-ton Tiger tanks and, having taken heavy losses, are forced to retreat. The following day, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel launches an assault to the west on the town of Gafsa, only recently occupied by the Allies. The attack succeeds in driving out the American and French troops. With British units providing covering fire, they fall back 40 miles to the city of Feriana, near Kasserine Pass. Meanwhile, the Allies have launched a counterattack to halt the German advance. During the night, however, the Germans move up and surround the Allied positions. In the ensuing battle, just over 200 of the Americans managed to break through the German lines. Most of the rest are taken prisoner. By the morning of the 16th, it is clear the attack has failed. As a result, the Axis assault on the Allied line continues, and by 18 February, Rommel and his Africa Corps are at the foot of Kasserine Pass. The road through the pass is defended by a hodgepodge of Allied troops, composed largely of American combat engineers with virtually no experience in battle. The full attack comes on the morning of 19 February. With mines slowing the enemy, and emboldened by the arrival of reinforcements, the Green Americans somehow hold their positions against Rommel's battle-hardened troops. By evening, the Germans are no longer attempting to advance, opting instead to bombard the Allied positions with their artillery. Finally, on the afternoon of 20 February, Nazi forces break through Kasserine Pass and continue their offensive. Rommel believes that the Axis should drive toward the Algerian city of Tebessa. However, the Italian High Command insists he press on to Le Cap. Scouts report that along the road between Kasserine and Le Cap, outside the town of Tala, Allied defenses are almost non-existent. Rommel mistakenly believes that they have concentrated their forces inside Tala and are preparing to attack. In response, he slows his advance. This pause gives the Allies, who are actually regrouping in Le Cap, an opportunity to move up and occupy the road to Tala. As the Germans and Italians begin their advance towards Tala on 22 February, they immediately fall under withering Allied fire. The massive bombardment causes Major General Fritz von Preuck to halt his advance and report to Rommel that a major Allied counteroffensive lies ahead. Preuck waits through the day for the onset of the offensive, but only a few British tanks come forward. Somehow, this convinces Preuck and Rommel of the seriousness of the Allied counteroffensive. Rommel calls off the assault. By 24 February, a disheartened Rommel and his tanks are en route back to the Mareth line. The Allies quickly re-establish themselves at Kasserine Pass. Though both the Allies and Axis have suffered huge losses, in terms of occupied territory, it is as if the past week never happened. Both sides are discouraged. The Americans are disgusted by the poor preparation and judgment shown at Kasserine, and have begun their search for a more decisive path to the end of the war in North Africa. For Erwin Rommel, the effects of this offensive are even more profound. After seeing how well supplied and supported his new American prisoners are in comparison to his own troops, he is coming to understand the scope of the U.S. war effort, and has begun to doubt the ability of the Axis to win in Africa. February 1943, the Russian front. After months of retreat and defensive action, German guns once again flash with offensive fire as Nazi troops under the command of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein returned to the role of aggressors. Since the beginning of the Stalingrad counteroffensive in November, Hitler's armies have by and large seen only defeat at the hands of their Russian adversaries. But now the tanks of the 1st and 4th Panzer Armies and the 2nd SS Panzer Corps begin pounding an unprepared and unsuspecting Red Army. Just days prior to the attack, an angry Adolf Hitler had come to von Manstein's headquarters at the town of Zaporozhye on the Dnieper River, with every intention of relieving him of duty. But the Field Marshal was ready with a plan that he was sure the Fuhrer would find appealing. In a scheme that mirrors Stalin's triumph at Stalingrad, von Manstein has withheld men and supplies from the fray, intentionally allowing the Russians to advance so rapidly that they have stretched their supply lines and exhausted their men. This quick push has created a salient, an inward bulge in the front lines. It is von Manstein's intention to send his armor north and south across the base of this bulge, cutting it off and trapping the advancing Russians. Hitler was more than pleased with the plan as presented. Having approved the plan, Hitler flew out of the airport at Zaporozhye leaving a relieved von Manstein behind. The field marshal's relief stemmed not just from having avoided dismissal, but from the fact that while the Nazi leader was present, lead tanks of the Russian advance had drawn within 6 miles of his headquarters. Now, with the battle underway and the Nazi tanks advancing, it is quickly becoming clear that the strategy that worked so well for Stalin and Zhukov at Stalingrad is fated to work equally well for Hitler and von Manstein. German infantry and armor, aided by Luftwaffe Stukas, tear through weary Red Army lines. Before long, those pushing to the south have ripped a 25-mile hole in the Russian defenses and are racing forward. The Wehrmacht and SS forces continue their advances through the next day, cutting rail links and supply lines as they go. By the evening of 22 February, the two forces have linked up and German commanders are able to report to von Manstein that the trap has been sprung. The Russians in the salient are surrounded. Von Manstein in turn reports to Hitler that the plan has succeeded. The Nazi leader is ecstatic. Not only have the Nazis won their first victory since the Russians surrounded and crushed the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, they have done so using Stalin's own strategy.
There is perhaps no greater spur to the development of new technology than war. In the desperation of battle, ideas that would be dismissed in less trying times as impractical or even impossible are tried and found to have merit. Certainly, one of the enduring legacies of World War II will be its contribution to engineering. Aircraft are being developed that in the post-war world will change the way mankind travels. Means of communication are being researched that will shrink the globe into what will be, in effect, a single village. And on the almost forgotten front in South Asia, where the Allies labor in jungles of obscurity, necessity has indeed become the mother of invention. There, the war is being fought over logistics. The Allies want to open the roads to resupply the Chinese. The Japanese seek to keep the roads closed. To keep those roads open, the Allies have recently unveiled a secret weapon of gargantuan proportions. A construction machine that would impress even the most seasoned jungle engineer, and a transportation system as endearing to the Burmese jungle fighters as the common jeep is to GIs in the muddy fields of Europe. The secret weapon? The elephant. Not sleek to look at, perhaps, but efficient in its own way. Weighing in at around 10 tons, the elephant runs not on gasoline, but on indigenous fuels. Grass, trees, vines to be found alongside construction sites. Back at the garage, elephants require little maintenance. A pat on the back, a handful of peanuts, an occasional spray down with fresh water. They move well through all terrains, uphill and down, as ably through deep mud as through choking dust. Elephants ford rivers effortlessly, even joyfully. Elephants are cost-effective as well. They fend for themselves at night, and the standard model comes equipped with a front-mounted crane to help with the heavy lifting. Soldiers working the Burma Road use elephants for moving the 2-ton logs that form the foundations for bridges, for knocking down pesky trees that block their path, and even for helping less advanced equipment that falls prey to weather or geography. The development of the elephant is a technological coup, to be sure. Allied intelligence reports that the Japanese, so proud of their own industrial prowess, have yet to unveil a pachyderm capability of their own. Certainly, this advantage bodes well for the end of the war and makes one wonder, what will they think of next? 1 March 1943, the Bismarck Sea, a Japanese convoy consisting of 8 Army transports and 8 destroyers sails for New Guinea. Aboard are almost 7,000 troops of the newly created Japanese 18th Army, being sent to reinforce the garrison at Lae. When it became evident to Japanese commanders they would have to cede Guadalcanal to the Americans, they decided to focus their attention on strengthening the rest of their bases in the Southwest Pacific, in hopes of stopping a further westward drive by the Allies. On the afternoon of the 2nd, after rounding Cape Gloucester, the convoy comes under attack from American heavy bombers. Before the attack is over, 1 transport is sunk and 2 others are damaged. Though the Japanese breathe a sigh of relief, in fact, their troubles have just begun. On 3 March, unsatisfied with their tally the day before, commanders of the American 5th Air Force launch a second strike on the Japanese convoy. Medium and heavy bombers with fighter escorts tear into the Japanese ships. Flying at wave-top level, they deliver their loads with devastating accuracy. Of 37 bombs dropped, 28 find their mark. The convoy is virtually wiped out. All 8 of the transports are sent to the bottom, along with 4 of their destroyer escorts. Japanese commanders are more and more frustrated. Sustaining their armies scattered around the Pacific is becoming increasingly difficult. The debacle in the Bismarck Sea is but the latest in a series of American successes against Japanese shipping. After learning some tough lessons at the hands of the German wolf packs, American naval commanders recognized the essential Japanese vulnerability. Submarines working in Pacific sea lanes could cut supply lines to isolated Pacific islands. American submarine construction increased dramatically, and the result of that is beginning to be seen. Now Japanese convoys not only must avoid American bombers close to their destination, but face the menace of American wolf packs lurking beneath Japan's home waters. In 1942, American subs sank 180 Japanese ships. Their success in the first 2 months of 1943 has American naval commanders almost giddy with excitement. If the current pace continues, twice as much Japanese shipping will be sunk this year as last. Despite being ravaged by the American U-boats, Japanese commanders have failed to utilize their own fleet of submarines. Instead of using them to cut the Americans' overstretched and vulnerable supply routes, they have employed them instead as a tool of diplomacy. Beginning in August 1942, Japanese submarines traveled 15,000 miles to the German U-boat base at Lorient, France, to deliver tons of zinc, tin, tungsten, and other raw materials to the Germans. Duly impressed with the feat, Hitler and Admiral Karl Dönitz, in turn, gave the Japanese plans for new types of artillery, aircraft engines, and, ironically, better submarines. Unfortunately for the Japanese, all of these subs are sent to a watery grave on their trip home. Ultimately, this war will be decided not so much by which side has the most or best equipment, but by which side can deliver it to the front. If Japanese convoys continue to be ravaged by American bombers and submarines, while U.S. supply lines go unmolested, Japanese garrisons throughout the Pacific will, quite simply, wither on the vine. March 1943, the English Channel. Almost a year to the day since its first mission against Essen, the Royal Air Force sends into the morning air 443 bombers to strike the German industrial center. Leading the way are fighters that have been outfitted with the RAF's new oboe radar precision bombing system. Some of the Halifax bombers are now carrying the H-2S centimetric radar. The British believe that these 2 systems will yield a vast improvement in accuracy over last year's disappointing performance in the pollution-shrouded Ruhr Valley. Since the RAF's last raid, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and Munitions, has raised German ammunition production over 100%, and tank and gun production by over 25% each. He has done this by the brutal application of slave labor, particularly in and around Essen. The first target of what is to be an aggressive campaign in the Ruhr Valley, Essen has been chosen by the Bomber Command not only for its high productivity, but for the great variety of goods made there. The successful destruction of Essen should disrupt almost every area of production. Tank hulls, anti-aircraft guns, howitzers, and millions of tons of ammunition annually pour out of the huge Essen manufacturing complex owned by the Krupp family. The Mosquito fighters, guided by the new oboe radar system, drop yellow flares to mark a path for the bombers. The Halifaxes follow, using their more accurate H-2S ground scanning radar to mark bombing areas with green and red flares, while simultaneously dropping incendiary bombs. This new technique, with its devotion to precision, is essential if the bombardiers are to be effective in the Ruhr, where vision is so obscured by coal dust and smoke that the pilots of the RAF call it black country. The Bomber Command hopes that the bombs will fall squarely in the center of the Krupp's 2-square-mile main manufacturing facility and will spare the housing provided for the enslaved workers. In a span of 40 minutes, the British bombers succeed on an unprecedented level. Those targets not hit directly by high explosive bombs are engulfed in secondary explosions and flames. 53 buildings are disabled, as well as Essen's power plant and several of the Krupp's coal mines. Due to insufficient anti-aircraft guns and the inferior radar of the German night flyers, only 14 British planes are downed. While the RAF has enjoyed a victory at Essen, it should be noted that there are many such manufacturing towns scattered across German territories. As a result, damage in Essen is a relatively minor setback for the Nazi war machine. The true value of the bombing of Essen can perhaps be found in the promise shown by the new techniques and the growing experience of the British flyers. Both offer hope that someday Hitler's factories might be shut down altogether. He can see as well that there is little cooperation even among German officers. And in the Italians he sees not so much an ally as another enemy. The Italian command is in fact openly lobbying for Rommel's removal. They blame the field marshal rather than a shortage of men and supplies for the loss of Libya, Mussolini's most important colony. As if to emphasize the disarray on the Axis side of the front, on 26 February, the German 10th and 15th Panzer Armies, under the command of Rommel's rival, General Oberst Jürgen von Arnim, begin Operation Bull's Head. Conceived and executed without Rommel's knowledge, it is a bold tank thrust west toward the town of Béja. Von Arnim overtakes an Allied radar station and breaks through British lines before being driven back. The attack is expensive for the Germans. 15 of 19 new Tiger tanks assigned to von Arnim's forces are destroyed. As Rommel contemplates his next move, on the other side of the front, the Allies are making moves of their own. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower, appalled at the American loss at Kasserine, decides on 4 March to install a new commander of the American Second Corps, General George S. Patton. A brash student of armor tactics, Patton has studied Rommel and dreamed of the day when he would face the Desert Fox in combat. On 6 February, as Patton is arriving at his new command, Rommel is mounting an assault on the town of Medellin. It is, he knows, a move more of desperation than strength. Stored in Medellin are thousands of tons of supplies, guns, ammunition, fuel, food, everything that it takes to support an army, everything the Allies are able to deliver, and the Axis is not. As his forces confront the British, Rommel knows that if the Afrika Korps fails to take Medellin and the Allied stockpiles there, North Africa is unquestionably lost. As the German tanks press forward, British soldiers manning what are apparently forward anti-tank batteries flee from their positions. Patton, upon receiving word of Rommel's departure, is incensed. A great believer in destiny, he was convinced that he and Rommel would face off. Now he knows it is likely never to be. Far from thwarting destiny, Rommel's departure seems in a way to have fulfilled it. For in 2 changes of command, one Allied and one Axis, the chemistry of the war has changed. The boldest of the German tank commanders has left, defeated and distraught. On the other side of the lines, the most aggressive of the Allied tankers has arrived, his polished helmet gleaming, his ivory-handled revolvers strapped to his hips. With this new sheriff in town, one can hardly help but think that the fate of fascism in North Africa has finally, completely, been sealed.
When Hitler and the Nazi High Command launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Russian Air Force was high on its list of targets. Although an enormous force, the Russian pilots were flying outdated machines that stood little chance against the state-of-the-art fighters employed by the Luftwaffe. Within a week of the invasion, 60% of the Red Air Force was destroyed, much of it without ever having left the ground. Flying planes fresh from the newly reassembled factories in Siberia, the Russians were able to keep the Luftwaffe off the backs of their ground troops, allowing them to effectively reinforce their positions. More important, they could directly attack the enemy's supply lines, leaving German troops to wither on the vine. Ground attack aircraft have allowed the Russians to blunt the German armor strikes that were so quick and deadly in the early days of the campaign. German tankers are, for the first time, facing a deadly menace in the skies. This new aerial equality is a welcome change for the Russian people. They are finally getting their revenge against the hated Luftwaffe. Downed German planes are sources of great curiosity. Souvenir hunters pick through the wreckage for a piece of the victory. Although the American military was caught grossly unprepared for the onset of war, its commanders have been quick to learn from their mistakes. Beyond correcting the obvious deficiencies in both the quality and quantity of equipment, great strides have been made in preparing the men themselves for the challenges they will face. Despite the victory on Guadalcanal, the American forces fighting there were severely bloodied by an enemy who was far more savvy about how to fight and survive in the jungle. On New Guinea and in Burma, American men also find themselves living and fighting in an environment for which they are wholly unprepared. Realizing that driving across the Pacific will mean wresting many more jungle islands from Japanese commanders have established schools to train their men in the ways of jungle warfare. Sites in Burma, as well as the hard-won jungles of Guadalcanal, are now serving as training grounds. The men are taught how to advance quietly through the jungle, ever alert for an enemy ambush. They receive one-on-one personal training as well as unit training. For most, it is the first time they have been exposed to the harsh jungle environment, and the instructors do everything possible to simulate combat situations. Roman candles are a favorite method to simulate hot-flying shrapnel. Beyond training and techniques for fighting in the jungle, the men are taught the do's and don'ts of living in the jungle. With instruction from veteran Australian troops as well as Burmese natives, the men learn how to distinguish edible fruits and vegetables from poisonous ones. They are introduced to what is surely the most versatile plant on Earth, the bamboo. It can be used for everything from constructing a lean-to shelter to a raft to a cooking pot for dinner.
16 March 1943, reeling from American attacks, Italians defending the Libyan town of Gafsa begin falling back toward El Guitar. They are being pressed by the American Second Corps, commanded by General George S. Patton. Patton is newly arrived in North Africa and absolutely convinced that it is his historic destiny to drive the Italians and their German allies back to the Reichstag. That is not an opinion shared by Patton's boss, British Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander. The Second Corps had, before the arrival of Patton, earned a reputation as a sloppy, disorganized outfit. Alexander does not believe that even Patton could substantially change that in less than the 1 month he has been in charge. Patton, of course, believes otherwise. He has for a month inflicted his regimen of discipline and hard work on the Corps, but the new and improved Second remains untested. Though Patton would prefer to pursue the Italians, Alexander has larger concerns. With a light armored unit moving against the airport at Metzuona, Alexander decides Patton could serve best by staying put, in effect protecting the British flank. Patton is furious. He believes that the British are conspiring against him, that they are holding him back to protect for themselves the hero's limelight. So, in open defiance of his superiors, he orders the 1st Armored Division to keep moving, to push toward the town of Magnassi. The British are irritated, but can do nothing to stop him, since Patton befogs the issue, pleading miscommunication and claiming that he is merely reacting to German movements. By 22 March, the 1st is in Magnassi, and is met there by elements of the German 10th Panzer Division. The thrust quickly bogs down as neither side is able to win a decisive advantage. As the 1st Armored Division has been pushing forward, so has the 1st Infantry. The Big Red One fights its way up the Gafsa-Gabas road toward El Guitar. On 23 March, the Germans mount a brutal counterattack. Units of the 10th Panzer sweep 50 heavy tanks against a force of American Shermans and half-track tank destroyers. The Germans take heavy losses, but the Americans are forced back. Short, as always, of logistical support, the Germans are forced to break off the attack to refuel and reinforce. During that lull, word filters back to the Allies of a plan for a new assault. It comes later that afternoon, and the Americans are ready for it. The panzers and the infantry accompanying them are greeted with a ruinous artillery barrage. Armor-piercing shells rain down on the tanks, and anti-personnel rounds explode above the troops, showering them with white-hot shrapnel. The Nazis that are not dead or wounded retreat. It is, Patton points out, the first time Americans have faced German tanks on prime tank ground and won. Patton cannot resist looking forward. His gaze shifts from El Guitar to the next town along the road, Gabas. He orders the 1st and 9th Infantry Divisions into the hills around El Guitar to dislodge the enemy from their fortifications in preparation for a move, but finds the Germans heavily dug in. Progress is nearly non-existent. The British, still driving into their section of the front, are also meeting stiff resistance. In a dry riverbed 110 miles from Gafsa, the Germans leave behind deep anti-tank trenches, minefields, and all kinds of booby traps. Then they take to the hills. There they await the British decision to move forward, across the riverbed under a well-directed artillery barrage, or try to find some alternative. April 1943, Rabaul, New Britain. 180 Japanese planes take off, heading towards Guadalcanal in an attempt to hinder the Allied drive westward. This assault, called Operation X, is the first phase of the Imperial Navy's two-stage plan, I Go. Under direction of the Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Navy, Isoroku Yamamoto, the plan calls for an initial strike against the Americans in the Solomons, followed shortly thereafter by a raid against Allied positions in New Guinea called Operation Y. Alerted to the impending Japanese action, the Americans have a host of Wildcats, Lightnings, and Corsairs waiting to intercept the approaching force. The American pilots receive assistance from the anti-aircraft guns on the ships below, and together they succeed in driving most of the Japanese away without taking substantial damage. At the end of the day, only 3 Allied ships have slipped to the floor of Iron Bottom Sound. Displeased by the failure of Operation X, Admiral Yamamoto nonetheless orders that preparations for Operation Y continue and plans a morale-boosting trip to inspect his frontline soldiers. His concern for his men does not go unnoticed by the Allies, however, as his itinerary is intercepted and forwarded to Admiral Chester Nimitz, who realizes the intercept could prove a mixed blessing. While the Allies would like very much to use the information to assassinate Yamamoto, doing so could reveal their knowledge of the Japanese code. It takes orders from the President himself to resolve the issue. Roosevelt orders that the mission to kill the man who planned Pearl Harbor be given top priority. On 17 April, orders arrive at Henderson Field from Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, instructing Major John Mitchell to lead a force of 18 P-38 Lightnings on a mission the next morning to reach and destroy the Betty bomber carrying General Yamamoto to Bougainville. The following morning, as the Japanese planes approached the Bougainville airfield, the Lightnings attack. While most focus their efforts on the Zero escort planes, 2 focus entirely on destroying the bombers. They succeed in downing the Betty carrying Yamamoto's Chief of Staff, General Ugaki, who survives the crash, and shortly thereafter destroy Yamamoto's, killing everyone on board. This delicate operation proves perfectly executed, as word spreads around the world of how American coast watchers spotted the planes and were responsible for the attack. While Allied knowledge of the Japanese code remains secret, U.S. commanders are still left with the unlikely possibility that Yamamoto's successor will be just as capable. And they wonder how much the death of just one man can turn the tide of a war. April 1943, England. Huge formations of Royal Air Force bombers take to the air and begin crossing the English Channel. Their target? The town of Essen in Germany's Ruhr Valley. This mission, one of many intended to devastate the Ruhr, the key industrial center of the Nazi war machine, is part of an ongoing air offensive designed to strike at the heart of Hitler's military might. Essen, the chief city of the Ruhr, is home to the Krupp's armament plants, as well as a large segment of Germany's steel-making industry. So, once again, it is here that the British bombers begin dropping their payloads. The bomber crews call the Ruhr Happy Valley, but their task is anything but joyous. Despite the short distance to the target, this is no milk run. Essen is the most heavily defended city in the region. In an attempt to obliterate the factories of Essen, the British have loaded their planes with the same incendiary-type bombs the Nazis used so effectively against England during the Blitz. Incendiaries don't just blow up, they start raging fires that incinerate everything in their paths. When the bombers turn toward home, they leave behind an inferno. Throughout the month of May, British bombs continue to fall on cities in the Ruhr Valley. Shortly after the second Essen raid, the British dispatched nearly 600 bombers to pound Dortmund, the forge of Germany. On 11 May, 572 RAF aircraft devastate Duisburg. As May draws to a close, cities all over the region exhibit the scars of continued air raids. The Allies, and in particular the British, are more than pleased. Intelligence reports indicate that the attacks are having a serious impact on the Nazis' industrial output. The operations of hundreds of factories, forges, coal mines, and munitions plants have been drastically slowed or shut down entirely. In addition, huge areas of the targeted cities have been reduced to rubble. It is this last fact that may reveal the one element of failure in this apparent Allied triumph. The seemingly arbitrary nature of the destruction stuns the citizens of the Ruhr and all of Germany. Advances in technology have played a crucial role in the annals of military history. The chariot, gunpowder, the machine gun, all advanced the art of armed conflict to a new level. While these improvements drastically changed the face of warfare, they did not change its fundamental nature, two opposing forces clashing on a well-defined battlefield. In this war, however, the airplane has utterly demolished this previously accepted law of warfare. Although the airplane played a part in the First World War, its role was limited to reconnaissance, ineffectual bombing, and the romanticism of one-on-one dogfighting. In this war, however, it has been turned into a devastating offensive weapon. No longer is the horror of warfare suffered only by those on the front lines. The civilian populations of entire nations have had the brutal reality of war dropped, literally, in their laps. Although it has become a pivotal part of all nations' armed forces, the Germans were the first to exploit the airplane's potential as a decisive weapon of war. From the moment the Nazis came to power, Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring began honing the Luftwaffe to be the principal instrument used to crush Europe under their boots and build their 1,000-year Reich. After tearing up the Treaty of Versailles, the Nazis embarked on an ambitious program of rearmament, the centerpiece of which was the Luftwaffe. Factories churned out fleets of warplanes in numbers never before imagined. In 1936, the world was given a glimpse of what was in store as Hitler sent squadrons of his bombers to aid fellow fascist Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War. By the time he invaded Poland in September 1939, Hitler had an air force second to none. Not only did they have more planes, the German pilots were flying machines that were faster, more agile, and packed a bigger punch than anything the Poles could muster. Perhaps most terrifying to the hopelessly outmatched Poles was the Junkers 87 dive bomber, better known as the Stuka. Diving on its target, it emits a piercing wail that alone is enough to strike fear in the hearts of those on the ground. Its incredible stability in an almost vertical dive allows it to deliver its bombs with astounding accuracy. The Stuka again demonstrated its deadly efficiency, pounding Allied armor as the Germans streaked across France. In the Battle of Britain, Hitler unleashed his fleets of bombers on the cities of England, and the world, for the first time, saw the horrifying offensive potential of the airplane. The oldest of the German bombers is the glass-nosed Heinkel HE-111. Designed in the early 30s as an airliner, it was quickly adopted by the Luftwaffe and saw extensive service in the Spanish Civil War. During the Battle of Britain, it was mauled by British fighters and quickly became relegated to the role of night bomber, a task which it performed with devastating effectiveness. Bigger, faster, and capable of carrying a larger bomb load than the venerable HE-111 is the Dornier DO-217. Operational in March 1941, the Dornier 2 has become a familiar sight in the skies over Europe and North Africa. Most versatile and numerous of the German bombers is the Junkers Ju-88. With a top speed of almost 300 miles per hour and capable of delivering over 6,000 pounds of bombs, it was far superior to any Allied bomber early in the war, and with subsequent modifications, is the equal of any in the air today. While these bombers have been the offensive weapons Hitler has used to take the war to the Allies, their success would not have been possible were it not for the support of a pair of world-class fighters, the Messerschmitt Me-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190. Designed in the mid-1930s, production of the Me-109 far and away exceeds that of any other German aircraft. Its role in the Battle of Britain alone has secured it, along with the British Spitfire, a place in history. Fast, agile, and capable of sustaining heavy damage, the Me-109 was, in the early days of the war, the preeminent fighter in the world, and is still a dangerous foe. Slated to replace the Me-109 is the Focke-Wulf 190. When it first appeared in the skies over Britain in 1941, the British were taken completely off guard. Capable of speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, the Focke-Wulf dominated the skies over Europe for nearly a year, and while the Allies have since equaled its performance, none have surpassed it. Although the Germans introduced the world to the horrific reality of modern aerial warfare, the Allies have been quick studies. They now have their own aerial armadas filling the skies over Germany, forcing the Luftwaffe to fight a defensive war it was never supposed to see. While Hitler and Goering were so certain that their bombers were the tools by which they would claim their place as the masters of Europe, their fighters may be the only thing standing between them and a crushing defeat. Now, don't get me wrong. There's nothing particularly surprising about a soldier having a nice, healthy interest in girls, kind of unofficially, in context, off hours. But now there are those who are concerned, wouldn't be too strong a word, concerned about the moral fiber of our boys over there. Now, it's not that we're being priggish. We understand. Pilots are different from the rest of us, and there's a long history of decorating airplanes. In World War I, the Lafayette Escadrille decorated its planes unofficially with an Indian head. Nothing wrong with that. It builds esprit. We loved how Eddie Rickenbacker, the ace of aces, went into battle sporting a jaunty top hat. The first Americans to serve in World War II, the American Volunteer Group in China, painted shark's teeth on their P-40s. It wasn't long before the locals started calling them flying tiger sharks, which the Americans shortened to flying tigers. That surely was what Secretary of War Henry Stinson had in mind when he decided to allow the individual decoration of aircraft. Build spirit, announced the bold new American presence. Surely he couldn't have been thinking of, well, you talk about a nose for girls. Oh, it's not just girls. There are other things painted by American flyers on their aircraft. There must be something. Oh, yes, there are names. Names of hometowns, names of cartoon characters, and names of girls. The fledgling artists are inspired by Antonio Vargas pinups, by the dream girls of Esquire magazine, and by the Hollywood starlets who are goodwill touring the world. What is amazing is how liberated the artists seem to feel. Good old American boys, far from home, paintbrush in hand. They could paint anything. They paint girls. For the first time in their lives, they are open and cheerful in their licentiousness as they head into battle. When the war ends, is this what we want the world to remember about their American visitors? It's probably too late to do anything about it. The English, saddled with thousands of American flyers, came to the conclusion that Americans have three problems. They are overpaid, oversexed, and over here. It's no wonder. Every time they look up at a passing plane, they see, well, a good deal more than a proper Englishman is used to seeing. Godspeed, boys. You've got a lot of life left to live. But don't forget all those girls back home. "22 April 1943, Tunisia. All across the front, British, American, and French forces opened fire on weary Axis troops, lighting the fuse of Operation Vulcan, the offensive that Allied commanders and soldiers alike hope will be the final nail in the coffin of the Wehrmacht in North Africa. To the northwest, the U.S. Second Corps, under the command of General Omar Bradley, begins advancing into the hills along the coast in an attempt to flank the enemy. The participation of the Americans in this offensive
is due only to the intervention of the Commander-in-Chief of Allied forces in North Africa, General Dwight Eisenhower. British General Harold Alexander, commander of Allied ground forces, had planned the operation as an all-British and French affair. The English military, from top to bottom, considered the Americans inferior fighters and would have been quite satisfied to administer the coup de grace on their own. Troops were about to be denied participation in the final victory of the campaign, took his complaint to Eisenhower, who in turn reminded Alexander exactly who was in charge in North Africa. Subsequently, the plans were modified so as to include Bradley's Second Corps. Elsewhere, at the southeast end of the front, the British Eighth Army, under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, begins attacking into the hills that stand between it and the city of Tunis. Montgomery, who shares the commonly held English view of the Americans, is determined that the men of the 8th, fresh from a rout of the Axis in the western desert, will grab the lion's share of the glory in this final battle. What neither Bradley nor Montgomery realize is that, despite suffering from shortages of food and supplies, the Germans are suffering from no shortage of the will to fight. While the Allies have been positioning for their assault, the Germans have been digging themselves into the hills that run all along their 130-mile defensive perimeter. Guns and mortars placed on mountains and ridges guard roads and valleys. Mines lie in wait in the flatlands. And the orders of German General Jürgen von Arnim that they should fight to the last bullet and the last man ring in the ears of every soldier. From the outset, both the Americans and the British 8th find themselves struggling. On 23 April, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, known to the men as the Big Red One, advanced toward their first major objective, an ominous rise known as Hill 609. In front of it lies a wide valley, which quickly garners the moniker the Mousetrap. Any attempted crossing draws deadly accurate fire from German guns stationed on the hill. With tanks and artillery supporting their effort, the men of the 1st begin to move along the rim of the valley toward Hill 609, but with little success. For days, they are able to make only slight advances, and by 26 April, they are completely pinned down by German artillery. Bradley calls in the 34th Infantry Division. Commanded by Major General Charles Wolcott Ryder, a hell-raising, tough-as-nails soldier who loves a good fight, the 34th had been the object of particularly derogatory remarks from British brass after their failure to drive the Germans from another hill earlier in the month. Using vindication as an incentive, Bradley tells Ryder that if he takes Hill 609, he'll not only break the back of the enemy's defensive line, he will erase all doubt about the mettle of his men. On the 27th, the 34th attacks toward Jebel El Hara, a village that Bradley believes is the key to taking Hill 609. A heavy barrage from the 2nd Corps artillery is to precede the assault, but is canceled 30 minutes before it is to begin when word is received that the 34th has already stormed the village and driven the enemy off. With Jebel El Hara as a staging area, the 34th, using tanks, guns, and sheer determination, begins moving up the rocky face of Hill 609. The fighting is bloody and bitter. By the end of the next day, the 34th has secured the hill, along with an unassailable reputation for bravery and tenacity. On the other hand, Montgomery and the British 8th are not doing nearly as well. They, too, are facing hills covered with well-entrenched German guns. The battles are long and bloody, with the Wehrmacht besting the British at nearly every turn. With casualties mounting and his advance bogging down, Montgomery finds himself in the uncomfortable position of having to ask Bradley if he might borrow a regimental combat team from the U.S. 2nd. Bradley responds curtly that only under direct orders from Eisenhower will he dispatch Americans to fight with the English army. Finally, with German guns beating back every attempt to advance, Montgomery is forced to break off the battle and withdraw. When word of the British defeat reaches 2nd Corps headquarters, Omar Bradley, a genial man not prone to reveling in the failures of others,
remarks to an aide that perhaps they ought to radio Monty and see if he wouldn't like a few American advisors to show them how to get through those hills. April 1943. British sailors aboard the submarine Seraph depart from Holy Loch on a mission which may be one of the strangest in military history. Aboard is the highest-ranking dead man ever conscripted into the Royal Marines. In the weeks leading up to this mission, known as Operation Mincemeat, the Allied High Command has been busy planning an attack on what Prime Minister Churchill refers to as the soft underbelly of the Axis, Italy. With the defeat of Axis forces in North Africa, Allied planners have turned their attention toward the island of Sicily. Once taken, the island will provide an excellent staging point for attacks on the Italian mainland. This attack is not unexpected by the Axis, and having witnessed the willingness with which the Italian soldiers surrendered in North Africa, Hitler deems it necessary to build up his own troops in Sicily. Allied planners quickly recognized that the rocky crags of Sicily were perfectly suited to a strong defense, and that troops assaulting the island would pay a high price. In spite of this, the plans went forward for the invasion because Allied commanders could find no alternative. That is, until an outlandish plan proposed by Commander Ewan Montagu found its way to the desk of Churchill's Chief of Staff. The plan met with the approval of the Chiefs of Staff, as well as Churchill, and Operation Mincemeat was born. Montagu's plan was to find a body, dress it up as a major in the Royal Marines, place false plans for an Allied invasion of Greece on the body, and see to it that it washed ashore in a place where the Nazis would find it. While some difficulty was encountered in finding an appropriate corpse, one was found, refrigerated, and drafted into the submarine service. Secrecy is of the utmost importance, and most of the men aboard the Seraph do not learn the nature of their bizarre mission even when returning home after releasing Major Martin into the waters off the coast of Huelva, Spain on 30 April. The Chiefs of Staff don't have to wait long to determine if the Major's body has been found, as Spanish officials return him in just a few days, without his attaché case bearing the secret plans. On 13 May, when the case and its contents are returned, British commanders feel certain that the papers have passed under German scrutiny and hope that their plan has worked. Hitler, for one, is convinced that the plans found on Major Martin are genuine and has begun shifting divisions from Sicily to Greece in anticipation of the attack. Mussolini, his instincts right for once, distrusts the plans and argues that forces should be maintained on the island. Hitler responds that the discovered plans simply confirm his earlier suspicion that the Allied attack would come through Greece. His faith is misplaced, or in this case at least, dead men do tell lies. April 1943, Liverpool. 43 merchant ships of Allied convoy ONS-5 set sail for America. Accompanying them are 8 escort ships whose mission it is to safely shepherd the convoy through the U-boat-infested waters of the North Atlantic. While the U-boat wolf packs have, since the outset of the war, been the scourge of British and American shipping efforts, it seems events are turning in the Allies' favor. As the war has worn on, the German U-boats have consistently sunk fewer and fewer Allied ships, while losing ever-increasing numbers of their own. This shift, it seems, is due to 2 factors, the first being awful weather. The fog and rain, so pervasive in the North Atlantic, effectively blind U-boats on the surface and make it nearly impossible to strike the Allies effectively. Working in concert with the weather is the spread of centimetric radar through the Allied fleet, permitting commanders to see the previously invisible submarines, an ability not lost even in the worst weather. Even if his U-boat fleet were operating at maximum strength instead of having nearly half its number in dry dock for repairs, Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz knows the U-boats would need to sink over 1 million tons of Allied shipping per month to have an impact on the war. In recent months, that figure has fallen to less than 250,000. In addition to their increased ability to evade and fight U-boats, the Allies have been producing Liberty ships much faster than the wolf packs could possibly destroy them. Despite his growing fear that his wolf packs will be unable to sufficiently disrupt Allied supply lines, Dönitz insists that the U-boat fleet maintain its aggressive anti-shipping campaign and orders that convoy ONS-5 be the next target. When a 40-sub wolf pack crosses paths with the convoy on 29 April, 500 miles off the coast of Greenland, the pattern of previous months begins to repeat itself. Foul weather forces the subs underwater, and Allied destroyers manage to fend off those submariners who do attempt an attack. The convoy loses only one ship. Dönitz responds to this meager performance by sending the bulk of the force to fairer climes in the southwest in a search for convoy SC-128, which succeeds in slipping past U-boat positions completely unnoticed. Their service is no longer required in the south. The Wolfpack returns to harass ONS-5. Clear weather on the night of 4 May permits an all-out assault on the convoy by 40 U-boats, which succeed in sinking 5 Allied vessels. On 5 May, fog grants a reprieve to exhausted crews on both sides. As evening falls, however, the Germans renew their assault, attempting 24 separate attacks over the course of the night. By the morning of 6 May, the Germans have sunk 12 Allied vessels, but at a cost of 9 U-boats. In the weeks that follow, the Allies continue to fare well. On 10 May, 4 U-boats are destroyed at the cost of only 4 merchant ships. Dönitz blames his U-boat commanders for the recent disasters. In the Pacific, it's a war of islands. The Japanese control most of the natural ones, the coral atolls and volcanic remnants that they have been collecting for the last 5 years. The Allies control almost nothing. The islands the Allies fight from are artificial. They have been called cities at sea, but in this war, aircraft carriers are more akin to islands than metropolises. It may seem at first absurd to compare actual points of land to ships, but in this case, the similarities are striking. The strategic value of the Japanese-held islands is not mineral. On the vast majority, there is no oil, coal, or smeltable ore. There is merely enough room for an airstrip, a place from which aircraft might fan out to patrol sea lanes crucial to the war effort. To do that, these islands have become home to close communities dedicated to a single end, the delivery of aircraft. So it is with the American aircraft carriers. Like the islands, they're small, just large enough for a single airstrip. And like the islands, for them to do their job, they are dependent on a small community that can minister not just to the needs of aircraft, but to the people who support them. Life aboard an American carrier is shaped not so much by war as it is by all the same social forces that have shaped America. With more than 3,000 crewmen aboard, the ship has a class structure, an economy, and mass media to disseminate information. The people who make the island's existence possible labor anonymously far below deck. Everything a carrier does is dependent on power, and all of that power comes from the boiler room. The boiler room is a hot, greasy place, the factory floor of the carrier. But its existence makes life on the rest of the ship possible. The crew lives a few decks above the boilers. Theirs is a compact but not uncomfortable existence. not unlike that of the Japanese island dwellers they've come to fight. There are hot meals to be had, with fresh vegetables and bread just out of the oven. There are barber shops, drugstores, and wardrooms for recreation. The crewmen can take in a movie or find a little quiet time for reading or writing letters home. One's social class on a carrier is determined by one's proximity to aircraft. The crewmen who work with the planes are higher up the ladder than those who don't. The plane captains, responsible for the care of specific aircraft, are the highest of the non-flyers. But it is the pilots who are the princes of the aircraft carrier. It is their lives that are, to the men below, almost blessed. In quiet times, it seems almost unfair. The white tablecloths and attentive stewards recall a pleasure cruise more than they do life in wartime. But quiet times on a carrier do not last. And when battle approaches, the dining rooms give way to briefing rooms, and the pilots must go out and fight. During battle, the entire character of the community changes. The cook becomes an anti-aircraft gunner. The barber becomes a bomb loader. The peaceable kingdom becomes what it was intended to be: closed, protected, deadly. And the pilots cease to be shipboard gourmands and become what they have always been: warriors. Everyone on the carrier cooperates to throw the planes forward into battle. On the tight confines of the flight deck, no mistakes can be tolerated. The planes are heavy with fuel and ordnance. One tiny misdirection could mean the death of the entire community. It is amazing, somehow, that the planes ever get into the air. But they do.